Good evening, everyone. My name is Sandra Collins and I'm the Director of the National Library of Ireland. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this special event from here in the National Library's Reading Room. This beautiful reading room opened to the public in 1890, and it has remained a special place of learning and discovery where we can share the extraordinary collections of the National Library. We're broadcasting this event as part of the Dublin Festival of History. We've been welcoming large audiences to our festival events for the last years, but this is our largest yet. It's wonderful to know that we have guests from all across the world, from all over Ireland, the United Kingdom, the United States of America, Germany, Belgium, Austria, Israel and Brazil. You're all very welcome. The National Library has been right at the heart of the decade of commemorations. That's because of our unparalleled collections, which are a key resource for the history of this island. We've been digitising and sharing thousands of photographs and letters and diaries and records that tell the story of this decade. Many of these documents focus on the unfolding drama of the treaty negotiations and their aftermath, including papers of the treaty delegation and staff such as Arthur Griffith and Kathleen McKenna Napoli, amongst many more. Other resources include political cartoons from contemporary newspapers, like the Seamus cartoon collection from the Freeman's Journal, as well as pro- and anti-treaty posters and leaflets and ephemera, and many photographs from the Hogan-Wilson collection. Our visual collections contain hundreds of photos of Michael Collins, some familiar and maybe some not quite so familiar, and you can find all these resources freely available in our online catalogue. Our programme of events includes online lectures and talks and tours and exhibitions, and they're all based on the collections here in the National Library, which we hope will continue to enlighten and inspire. Tonight, we're especially pleased to be bringing this event in partnership with our sister institution, the National Archives of Ireland. It's been a real pleasure working with the National Archives, so I'm delighted to hand over now to their director, Orla McBride.
Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you all here to this, the first event as part of the National Archives Autumn Programme under our overall commemorations programme for 2021, which will culminate in our Treaty 1921 Records from the Archives exhibition, opening on the 6th of December in Dublin Castle, having had a preview exhibition opening in London next month on the 11th of October, 100 years to the day that the plenipotentiaries first entered Downing Street to commence the treaty negotiations in London. So this evening, we're delighted to be partnering with our colleagues in the National Library as part of the Dublin Festival of History on this lecture, Bring Me Into the Spotlight of a London Conference, Michael Collins from Truce to Treaty, with Dr. Anne Dolan, who's Associate Professor of Modern Irish History in Trinity College Dublin, and Dr. William Murphy, Associate Professor of the School of History and Geography in Dublin City University, who are joint authors of Michael Collins' The Man and the Revolution. Their Man and Revolution was described in the Irish Times as not just another biography of Collins. Instead, the authors have unpacked him through the exploration of key themes: his administrative and military methods, his practice of politics, his beliefs in celebrity, and then his death and afterlives. The range of documents and photographs reproduced is another strength of the book, allowing readers to see for themselves how Collins and his contemporaries enunciated the themes covered. It is scholarly work such as this from historians like Anne and Richard that allow us all to understand and reflect on this period of our history, and in particular the legacy of Collins 100 years later. We are also delighted to welcome David McCullough, RTE, who really needs no introduction, journalist, presenter, author of the reluctant Taoiseach, a biography of John A. Costello, and 2 volumes of biography of Eamon de Valera. He's a very good friend of the National Archives, with his dedicated work each year when we release records under the 30-year rule. We hope that the release of the Anglo-Irish records under the 20-year rule later this year will provide rich pickings for David over the Christmas period. And now, without further ado, I hand over to David. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Orla. That sounds like my Christmas is ruined anyway, but not to worry. It's a real pleasure to be here in this beautiful room in the heart of Dublin for this very interesting discussion, and delighted to welcome everybody who's joining in the session tonight. Just 2 housekeeping things before we start. I see people already using the chat function. Please feel free to use that. But if you have a question for our panellists, and I hope you do, I'm looking forward to reading them and putting them to them, please use the Q&A function. So any questions, if you could put them into the Q&A section, that would be great. If you are using Twitter, I'm sure you're going to be too enthralled by what we have to say to spend too much time on Twitter, but if you are using Twitter, please use the hashtag Treaty21, and we'll try and get a few of those comments as well if we can. So here we are at, as recent events have shown, the more interesting end of the decade of centenaries, the more controversial end and events of 100 years ago, and very few of those events of 100 years ago are more controversial than what we're here to talk about tonight, the signing of the treaty. Good deal or bad deal? Pragmatic compromise or betrayal? The arguments are never ending, which I suppose is why so many of you are tuning in tonight. The discussion of individuals and of personality is a little bit unfashionable in historical circles, but I think when you look at the treaty, you can see the force of individuals, and you can see the effect of their personalities, whether it's the personalities that weren't in the room, James Craig and Eamon de Valera being the prime examples, or the personalities who were in the room, David Lloyd George, Winston Churchill, Arthur Griffith, and of course the man we all know, or we all think we know, Michael Collins. A lot has been written about Michael Collins, some of it worthwhile, much of it not, but as Orla has mentioned, few books about him are as revealing or as thought-provoking as the one written by our 2 speakers tonight. Michael Collins, The Man and the Revolution, published in 2018, really is a must-read for anyone who wants to think about or talk about the period in question. Anne Dolan is an Associate Professor in Modern Irish History at Trinity College. As well as the Collins book, her research focuses on the history of violence in the revolutionary period and on the social and cultural history of interwar Ireland. She's co-edited the Civil War papers of Ernie O'Malley, No Surrender Here, and has also written the definitive work on the commemoration of the Civil War. Will Murphy is Associate Professor in the School of History at DCU. He has written on political imprisonment in the War of Independence period, as well as on leisure and the Irish in the 19th century and on the GAA. Will is going to talk to us shortly about how Collins justified his signature on the treaty. But first, we're going to hear from Anne about perceptions of Collins during the time of the treaty negotiations and afterwards. So just a reminder, if you have questions for later on, please use the Q&A function on Zoom, and the hashtag for Twitter is hashtag Treaty21. But with that, I'm going to hand over to Anne.
Thank you, David. Before we begin, we would like to thank the directors of the National Library of Ireland and the National Archives of Ireland, Sandra Collins and Orla McBride, and particularly Elizabeth McAvoy of the National Archives for inviting us to speak to you this evening. Rather than move through the twists and turns of what Collins did next in that period from Truce in July to treaty signed on the 6th of December 1921, we would like to raise some of the things that intrigued and puzzled us about Collins in those months, and in some respects they might well have been the things that shaped his decisions or perhaps dictated his course of action for the rest of his life. It all depends really on the Collins you conceive of. If you think of him as the guerrilla leader, as the man who won the war, as Arthur Griffith called him in the treaty debates, these are the months that perhaps challenge your expectations of him most. Why did he go to London? Why did he accept something less than a republic when he was there? He becomes either the man outwitted by superior negotiators, bedazzled by London society, or he finds himself the benighted pawn, duped into going by a duplicitous De Valera who knew there was never a republic to bring home. Of course, Collins was part of the negotiating team because of his influence over the IRA, because he was head of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. If there was going to be a settlement of any kind, it was hoped he was the one who could best sell a compromise to the military men. But we rarely, if ever, conceive of the choice of him to negotiate because he was Minister for Finance. It is unthinkable that a delegation would go without the holder of that cabinet position, but such is our sense of Collins as the military man that that position hardly ever impinges on our thinking. He was the only Irish delegate to serve on all three of the negotiations subcommittees, on financial relations, on defence and on observance of the truce. However much he pleaded before he was sent that he was no politician, we should not discount that that is what he very much was. But even if we persist in conceiving of Collins as the ordinary soldier he often said he was, I think we need to complicate that quite a bit too. With Griffith and Mulcahy, he was among the Dáil ministers who looked relatively favourably on the terms offered by Lloyd George to De Valera in July 1921, relatively being the key word in that sentence. Frank Pakenham, in his still gripping 1935 account of the treaty negotiations, characterised Collins from July onwards, as he put it, as no fanatic, that he was too concerned with men and women in the present, too determined to find some immediate way of assisting them, to have too much time for the meaning and integrity of symbols. An Ireland free of British soldiers and British laws, now he could do something with that. Truce brought Collins, fighting man or politician, out into the open, and so much of what followed in those weeks and months revolved around perceptions of him, and whether he lived up to or down to the different reputations he had by then acquired. In May 1921, he pondered how the latest failure by British forces to capture him might be perceived, and I think in a way this is instructive of this sense of himself at that time. He said, "It was the most providential escape yet. It will probably have the effect of making them think that I am even more mysterious than they believe me to be, and that is saying a good deal." We cannot doubt that Collins knew precisely the power of this persona and capitalised when he could on what people wanted or seemed willing to believe. "Anything that can be said about me, say it," was how he responded to Minister for Defence Cathal Brua's accusations during the treaty debates that he had played up to the newspapers to exaggerate his own role. Someone who opted in such circumstances for such a reply cannot be neatly separated from the stories about him, wheat from chaff. The real Michael Collins, to use Peter Hart's term, was only ever in the eye of the beholder, and Collins, even from his earliest teenage days in London, was quick to make a virtue out of that. Collins was born just 5 years after linotype transformed the pace of news and 2 years after the invention of the Kodak camera. He was 3 years old when Edison produced moving pictures and 5 when Marconi invented the telegraph, and each contributed to the perception of the man who arrived to negotiate a treaty in London. Given all that most people knew was the Collins that they had stitched together out of rumours and gossip and what the newspapers said, we have to take account, I think, of at least some of the Collinses the newspapers produced. By the time he travelled to London for the negotiations in October 1921, his name was sufficiently famous or notorious that he was the one the British press and the public wanted to see. His was the name chanted when the Irish delegation arrived without him in the early days of October. He was the one who knew how to make an entrance, you might argue, by coming over after them. Mobbed, feted, even propositioned, he had become the sum of what amounted to the Irish Revolution in many British eyes, at least as they read it fresh in their newspapers every morning with their toast and tea. In many ways, the manipulation of the Collins character in these months is key to understanding how much the ground needed to be prepared on the British side in order to negotiate. In his memoir, William Darling recalled meeting Collins just before the truce. When Collins admitted who he was, Darling confessed he rather rudely said, "Are you the Michael Collins whom the British police have made famous?" When Collins asked him to explain what he meant by this, Darling, who was then working in Dublin Castle in General Tudor's office, replied, "A police force has a duty to apprehend criminals. If they fail to apprehend criminals, one defence is to say, that the criminal is the most astute, remarkable, astonishing criminal in history, to which Collins apparently laughed aloud. But even in a quick survey of the British national and regional press through late 1920 and across 1921, this elusive Michael Collins persona, created maybe to save British blushes, is remarkably easy to find. As early as October 1920, papers were reporting on the notorious Michael Collins. By November 1920, he had become the mystery of Collins. By January 21, some were even, as one put it, beginning to wonder if there is such a man. Such were the powers of the elusive mystery man of Ireland. By February 1921, he was already a man of mystery. A month later, the Dundee Evening Telegraph called him the most wanted man in the world, with all the urgency that uppercase headline letters could bring. Romance of elusive Michael Collins, troops who did not look for him in a coffin, a master of disguise with about half a dozen doubles followed fast upon these capitalised words and headlines, and suggests much of how this man was being written about. He was even the Moriarty of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, swearing he will never be taken alive. By early 1921, his notoriety was such that an American journalist quipped back to his editor from Dublin, "No interview with Collins. Did not find the man, found a God." In some respects, these types of headlines had done the British government some considerable service. By crafting Collins into the elusive Michael Collins, by making him a dastardly Moriarty, the genius of fighting Ireland, it seemed understandable, reasonable almost, that such a man should never be caught. Equally, the smiling, charming Collins that emerged in the London gossip columns in October 1921, or the gallant, heroic Collins that surfaced by December 1921, the coolest man on board, one paper said, helping to launch lifeboats when the Dublin mail boat he travelled on collided with another boat, countered the vigorous criticism that the Prime Minister was sitting down to deal with a murderer, something Lloyd George felt the public could not accept or countenance just a matter of months before. Back in the summer of 1921, Lloyd George set his own problem plainly out. "The question is whether I can see Michael Collins, whether the British people would be willing for us to negotiate with the head of a band of murderers. It would be rather like the Prime Minister of the day seeing Kelly, who was engaged in the Phoenix Park murders." The softening of Collins's image in the British press, the kind of Collins who had romantic adventures and escapades, may bear some relationship to Lloyd George's need to prepare the British public for the thought of such a man inside Downing Street. Just days after the negotiations began, Churchill's private secretary, Edward Marsh, felt the need to write to the Morning Post in order to deny the allegation that had emerged in the press that Mr. Churchill had been listening with interest to Mr. Michael Collins's adventures inside Number 10. In October 1921, we have to remember it was as delicate for Churchill and his colleagues as that. Their careers, their political reputations were at stake. While the Edinburgh Evening News was confident, as they said, that the fighter has now become a friend, the Manchester Guardian provided its readers with a slightly more sceptical insight. It wrote, "The success of England is largely due to her bad memory, in knowing when it was expedient to forget." And Collins certainly knew exactly what was going on in all of this. He said, "I would not matter very much to anybody were it not for the things the English are saying about me," he admitted as early as May 1921. And if we can believe Hayden Talbot's own story of Collins, the value Collins placed on his own legend was clear. Talbot records him making the following case as to why De Valera should not have sent him to London to negotiate. And we have to remember this is if you like, a case he made after all of these events have taken place. But he said, "For several years, rightly or wrongly makes no difference, the English had held me to be the one man most necessary to capture, because they held me to be the one man responsible for the smashing of their Secret Service organisation and for their failure to terrorise the Irish people with their blackened hands. Brua has spoken of this English legend as having been altogether of newspaper manufacture. What difference does that make? The important fact was that in England, as in Ireland, the Michael Collins legend existed. It pictured me a mysterious, active menace, elusive, unknown, unaccountable. And in this respect, I was the only living Irishman of whom this could be said. If and as long as the legend continued to exert its influence on English minds, the accruing advantage to our cause would continue. Bring me into the spotlight of a London conference, and quickly would be discovered the common clay of which I am made. The glamour of the legendary figure would be gone forever. On the 11th of October, the day the negotiations began in London, David Lowe drew this cartoon called Mysterious Mick Collins for the Star. And this smiling, jocular, quite rotund figure that he depicted rather simply proved Collins's point. He was not very menacing or mysterious anymore. Although the wariness of Collins and of the act of negotiation certainly remained, there was even anxiety in London about if or how an opening handshake with the Irish delegation would be handled. The news coverage of the negotiations tell us something more. Many in Whitehall also seem to have been beguiled by the Collins persona. On the day negotiations began, one newspaper reported as follows that the dignified windows of the Foreign Office facing the Premier's residence were filled with official heads intensely watching the scene, and high officials may have caught the cry, "Up the rebels," from the crowd beneath. Of course, they continued, all eyes were eager for a glimpse of the redoubtable Sinn Féin Commander-in-Chief, the elusive Mr. Michael Collins, whose athletic form and pugnacious features were soon picked out. It seems the civil servants in the Foreign Office were as curious as all the rest. The British negotiating team and those in its inner circle seemed familiar with the myths as well, seemed to have been led to expect someone far more impressive than the man they encountered. Many of those close to the negotiations recorded a private disappointment on their first encounter with him that suggests something had led them to believe he would be made of more. Although the Manchester Guardian insisted, as they said, that British ministers who had accepted Dublin Castle's theory of Collins as the bloodthirsty chief of a murder gang found themselves instead confronted with a severely practical politician tenacious in his demands, it does seem that their expectations of him were not met for quite different reasons. Neville Macready called him a great disappointment, flippantly trying to get out of corners by poor jokes in bad taste. Lloyd George referred to his simple sort of mind, the mind, he said, found in a great military commander, but a simple one nonetheless. Collins was an uneducated, rather stupid man, according to Manchester Guardian editor C.P. Scott, although Scott still maintained he liked him with the next breath. Most of them seemed so struck by his ordinariness that they must have come to take the newspaper version of him at least somewhat to heart. Gossip columns lapped up and dished out the anecdotes from the negotiations, and Frank O'Connor, later writing about Collins in his 1930s biography, even argued that Collins's presence alone assures the negotiations a good press, that the media simply delighted in him. And maybe they did that a little bit too much. The crush of women, the press described sending him off from Euston Station in early December 1921. The woman who broke through the cordon of police, who was described planting kisses upon his cheeks with wonderful rapidity, show us maybe a little of this. And the way he cut a dash was a distraction. Tom Jones, secretary to the British delegation, later wrote of the girls who pursued him for favours, while the travel writer H.V. Morton remembered the fierce competition, he said, among society hostesses to produce Mick Collins at a dinner party, that Collins had to fight hard against becoming what Morton called a social sight. The Irish delegation even admitted to one reporter that quite a number of extraordinary individuals called to Hans Place with the object of being photographed with Mr. Michael Collins. And all of this made it harder for him at home. The newspaper's larger-than-life Collins prodded at sullen jealousies. It reduced Collins to a caricature of himself, made him a far more divisive figure when writ so large in the newspaper's trenchant black and white. It could be seen in the attack on him in the treaty debates by Seamus Robinson and Cathal Brugha. It allowed Countess Markievicz to try for silly victories in the debates because he had become someone silly stories stuck to. I also heard, she said, that the Princess Mary is to be married to Michael Collins, as if to seal the treaty deal. It only made sense to throw that kind of allegation at him alone. With so much attention, he had far less room for manoeuvre, at least in all the ways he might have liked. If the newspapers said he was weakening, being too friendly or too fierce with Craig or Churchill, with De Valera or whoever else they reported him meeting with, the newspaper certainly shaped the views of those who only read the headlines and were never privy to Collins's own plans or views. Sir Henry Wilson certainly took Collins at the Daily Herald's word back in October 1921. Wilson noted in his diary, "In today's Daily Herald, Michael Collins openly boasts that he has and will again hold up the British Empire. It is true," he said. While nothing was going to change Wilson's mind about Michael Collins, it is striking that even he shaped his sense of Collins from what the newspapers had to say. In the same way that the masked photographers must have made Collins's task in London more difficult, positive and negative newspaper reports, even if they did not impinge on his own position, must have made it harder to convince his allies and opponents that he was not only the sum of what the newspapers said he was. And by late 1921, convincing others was a considerable part of the battles he fought on all fronts. The attention and scrutiny he had come under in those months from truce to treaty had helped and hindered him already, made him more ominous, more mysterious, more illustrious than he ever was, made it harder for him to hide and harder for others to accept the limits of what he amounted to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. Fascinating and lots of food for thought there, which we'll maybe explore a little bit later. But before we do, we're also going to hear from your co-author, Will Murphy.
In his great book on the making of the English working class, the historian E.P. Thompson described his task as rescuing the ordinary lives from the enormous condescension of posterity. Thompson's heroes were barely noticed when they lived and afterward were quickly forgotten. This, as Anne's talk so vividly reminded us, was not Michael Collins' fate. Yet posterity has treated him too with a strange condescension. In all the many words written on Collins in general, and on Collins and the treaty in particular, for all the repeated questions, we have comparatively rarely asked, what did Michael Collins believe? For generations of politicians, this has proved a useful neglect. Into the vacuum has rushed all manner of ahistorical nonsense, imagined Irelands that Collins would have created or endorsed, all of which, strangely, or maybe not, happen to coincide with the views of the particular politician making the speech. Collins himself bears some of the blame for this. He encouraged the tendency by presenting himself as a realist who acted rather than an idealist who thought or talked. It was a self-image he both actively promoted and believed in. When writing from London 4 days into the treaty negotiations, Collins offered his views to De Valera on the appropriate members for a fundraising delegation to the United States of America. He wrote that it was practical work, rather than the ability to speak, that counted. If a speaker is not practical, it will only be so much wasted money, at least in my view. The practical people will get the money, the speakers will not. 6 weeks later, on the 30th of November, as the treaty endgame approached, he put his view even more bluntly in a letter to Kitty Kiernan. "I'm on the side of those who do things, not on the side of those who say things, and that's that." On the other hand, in the aftermath of the treaty, Collins knew that it was not enough to do. He had to explain what had been done. As Anne has suggested, he realised that there was no returning to the shadows. From that period, we have his contributions to the Dáil debates, but more than that, we have a stream of articles and speeches, some of which were published posthumously in The Path to Freedom by the Talbot Press in 1922. Some months earlier, Martin Lester Limited had published Arguments for the Treaty by Michael Collins, a collection of several speeches he had made between December 1921 and March 1922. For a while in the spring of 1922, he and De Valera seemed to be engaged in an intimate conversation in public. taking up and turning over the other's metaphors in platform speeches that became newspaper reports before, and without much delay, appearing as propaganda posters. In one such exchange, the journey across the desert, with all its biblical import, was invoked by these ordinary men who had become rival Moses. On the 26th of February, De Valera told a crowd in Limerick, "We must toil on. We are as a party which has set out across the desert. We have not yet got to the end of it, and there are some who have come along and tell us, lie down there and be satisfied and don't go on. We ask you to stick it out, to cross the desert, and not to listen to those who would tell you of your own weakness. Think not of your weakness and of the strength of the enemy, but think of your strength and of the weakness of the enemy, and we shall win." A week later, on the 5th of March, at a meeting in Dublin, Collins, answering De Valera directly, found in this metaphor a new way to make what was becoming his familiar case. "Yes," he said, "we had come by the means of the treaty to a green oasis, the last in the long, weary desert over which the Irish nation has been travelling. Oases are resting places of the desert, and unless the traveller finds them and refreshes himself, he never reaches his destination. Ireland has been brought to the last one, beyond which there is but a little and an easy stretch to go. The nation has earned the right to rest a little while we renew our strength." Collins extended the metaphor a good deal further, implying that the Dublin crowd all knew who had guided them to the oasis, and who, in contrast, was, quote, poisoning the well. In that 5th of March speech, he invoked the word nation again and again. Collins believed without equivocation that the Irish were a separate nation, and because of this they had a moral entitlement to self-governance. This belief was grounded in a 19th century romantic understanding of the nation, which existed, or as he put it, had survived, albeit drooped and weakened, as a national spirit or as a soul. During the treaty debates, he used the compound phrase, "our continued national and spiritual existence." This was language borrowed from contemporary and earlier generations of Irish Romantic nationalists, who had in turn borrowed it from European Romantic nationalists. Collins conceived of the process by which Ireland would rejuvenate its nationality and assert its freedom in 3 stages. Again, this was rather typical of his contemporaries. First, the cultural and separatist political movements had to counteract the poison of foreign ways. Limited monarchy, with the British gone, the poison of foreign ways. Which had infected the nation during the centuries of foreign usurping government. Poison was another favourite word of his, as were variants of disease and infection, especially when he talked of or wrote about his opponents. The next stage, the second stage, was armed resistance. It was, he insisted, the indispensable factor in our struggle for freedom. A nation for Collins was really not a nation unless it was a nation under arms. He was very insistent on this during the treaty negotiations, battling from the first week to the final evening for the right of the new state to have its own navy. On the morning of the 5th of December, infamously, Lloyd George and Collins alone met in an attempt to rescue what seemed to be a collapsing talks process. If we look at the changes to the draft agreement achieved by the Irish in the aftermath of that meeting, then the importance to Collins of the nation under arms is confirmed. The word local was removed from the clause describing the Irish Free State's military. It would be a national army, while the prospect of developing an Irish navy was opened up. Once freedom had been achieved, there came for Collins the third phase. As he put it in August 1922, the negative work of expelling the English power is done. The positive work of building a Gaelic Ireland in the vacuum left has now to be undertaken. In his Civil War prison memoir, the Republican socialist Peadar O'Donnell painted a second-hand portrait of Collins's mind. It was both critical and sympathetic. Critical because he disagreed with Collins, and sympathetic, at least in part, because his source, fellow prisoner at Mountjoy, Dick Barrett, had been very close to Collins. O'Donnell wrote of Collins that, without any guidance except his own turbulent nationalism, He confused the conquest with the mere occupation of the country with British soldiers and the personal influence of undesirables. He failed to recognise that the military occupation was merely to make the imperial exploitation possible, and so he guaranteed to safeguard the exploiting interests if the soldiers were withdrawn. Leaving aside for a moment the condescending tone, O'Donnell had, via Barrett, identified a core Collins position. The key consequence of the treaty, Collins maintained, was the evacuation of the British. And it is the evacuation by the British which gives us our freedom, he said. This was the proof of success, he insisted, not the name for nor the form of the government we have chosen. If we had still a descendant of our Irish kings left, we would be free under that. We would be as free under a limited monarchy with the British gone as under a republic. Elsewhere, he made the same point in a different way. The British form of government was monarchical. In order to express this clearly, our desire to depart from all British forms of government, we declare a republic. We repudiated the British form of government, not because it was monarchical, but because it was British. We would have repudiated the claim of a British republic to rule over us as definitely as we repudiated the claim of the British monarchy. This last point sounds rather too clever to be sincere. It downplays the extent to which the Dominion status was a disappointment. In his 1980 book, The Birth of the Irish Free State, Joseph M. Curtin emphasised that Collins was, in truth, deeply reluctant to accept Dominion status, assuming responsibility for that decision only on the basis that he had decided there was no other choice. At the same time, Curran suggested, Collins understood the trend of Commonwealth development, and he felt sure a Dominion settlement would give Ireland virtual sovereignty and open the way to full independence. Curran seems to be turning Collins into a futurist here, along with all his other accumulated roles and ascribed virtues, and yet there is some evidence for this. On the first afternoon of the negotiations, when Griffith pressed that the Irish political entity to emerge should have the right to remain neutral if Britain went to war, Lloyd George responded to the effect that Dominions had a choice as to whether to put troops in the field or not. But if Britain went to war, a Dominion would be at war. Lloyd George went on to argue, according to Tom Jones, that the fundamental question regarding Dominion status was, are you coming in freely with A, absolute guarantees of freedom, B, full recognition of nationhood, and C, inside the fraternity of free nations? At this point, according to Jones' diary, Griffith quite reasonably pointed out, we cannot enter freely if it is not a free choice, followed by an interesting intervention from Collins, noting that Bonner Law said that Dominions could vote themselves out of the British Empire. Collins, it seems, had recognised that even if entry was not in reality a choice freely made, then maybe the terms of membership implied that the freedom to leave at some point in the future. Despite Padder O'Donnell's criticisms referred to earlier, Collins was mindful that Ireland's economic relationship to Britain was deeply implicated in the question of freedom. His approach to this issue shows signs of the language of protectionism, tillage and self-sufficiency borrowed from Arthur Griffith, language that would sit at the core of Fianna Fáil's economic approach throughout the 1920s and 30s, indeed right up until the 1950s. During the treaty debates on the 19th of December, for example, he characterised the colonisation of Ireland in economic terms. It had been, he said, a story of slow, steady economic encroach by England. It had been a struggle on our part to prevent that, a struggle against exploitation, a struggle against the cancer that was eating up our lives. And it was only after discovering that it was economic penetration that we discovered that political freedom was necessary in order that should be stopped. Later in the same speech, he insisted, every day some other business concern in this city is taken over by an English concern and becomes a little oasis of English customs and manners. Nobody notices, but that is the thing that has destroyed Gaelic civilization. There is that word oasis again, and once more the deployment of the disease metaphors. In a piece from 1922 entitled "Building Up Ireland," he presented his alternative. He wrote, "The key to the economic revival must be the development of Irish resources by Irish capital for the benefit of the Irish consumer in such a way that the people have steady work at just remuneration and their own share of control." How this was to be arrived at was more than a little hazy. But at the treaty negotiations, he and Griffith had both been very exercised that the new state should have the right to impose tariffs, including on British goods. At the third session, on the 13th of October, Collins repeatedly insisted that it was necessary that they should have the right to raise such trade defences. Otherwise, he asked, how can we protect ourselves against the danger of dumping? Further, he insisted, all the cheap labour in Ireland would not enable us to stand up against one of those big combines. And again, we do not want to impose a tariff on Britain, but we want the free development of our industrial life. It is interesting then, if we return once more to the Collins meeting with Lloyd George on the morning of the 5th of December, that Collins pressed the matter of trade on that occasion. In the final hours, Lloyd George conceded full fiscal autonomy to the Irish state, including the capacity to impose tariffs. All the accounts of the negotiations agree that Griffith and Collins led the 5-team Irish delegation. In doing so, they faced considerable disadvantages. The team was inexperienced and arguably it was weak. Lloyd George quickly decided that Griffith and Collins were the only negotiators of substance, and Churchill's later account confirms that this was a view shared by others on the British delegation. Crucially, from the beginning, the plenipotentiaries and those at home were divided as to what would constitute success. This ensured that their preparations for and conduct of the talks were disjointed, even incoherent. Collins's tendency to hold himself apart from his colleagues, to the extent of living separately while in London, probably exacerbated these problems, but the root cause was the ideological differences between them. Their opponents, on the other hand, were more powerful, were more experienced, and though somewhat divided as to the ideal outcome, had a clearer sense of a shared bottom line. During the negotiations, Erskine Childers, who was one of the secretaries to the negotiating team, was, on occasion, critical of Collins' knowledge and grasp of particular issues. On the other hand, in his history of the negotiations, Frank Pakenham described what he called Collins' assimilative intellect and thought it was an asset. Generally, Collins does seem to have deployed his grasp of detail to good effect. Of course, despite real successes during the negotiation process, the delegations could not deliver the Republic, while neither he nor his colleagues recognised the dangers in the ambiguous drafting of Clause 12 as it related to what would be called the Boundary Commission. If Collins, the negotiator, could be forensic, he was also prepared, if he thought it useful, to be belligerent and robust, playing the blunt soldier or the simple countryman seeking a straightforward answer. Anne has referred to some of the reactions he evoked when he indulged in this kind of behaviour. Mark Sturgis, a senior official at Dublin Castle, who met him to discuss the maintenance of the truce, recorded the aspects of Collins' personality that he seemed to project when faced by British politicians and elite civil servants. Or at least Sturgis recorded the aspects they tended to see. This is the quote. "He is just the big, young, pleasant, prosperous, self-satisfied cattle dealer in a big way of business. But he is undoubtedly quick to understand, and I should imagine is twice the man if he is up against you, strong, brave, and quite ruthless." Collins provided men like Sturgis with someone they thought they recognised, someone they believed they could deal with, yet someone they would be foolish to take for granted. In this regard, it seems that there was a considerable overlap between what Collins wanted his British interlocutors to see and what they saw. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Will. And Will and Anne, between them, have given us plenty to think about, plenty to talk about. I see some questions coming in on the Q&A already, but please do keep those questions coming in, and we're going to get to as many as we can. We just need one moment to reset a few things, and we'll be right back with you, so get those questions coming in. Well, welcome back. We're still here in the National Library in the reading room with Will Murphy and Anne Dolan, and we've just had two fascinating presentations about Michael Collins and the treaty, the events of a century ago. Just before I go to some of the questions that are coming in thick and fast now, I'm going to have to try and keep up with them, just to get a sense of how Collins ended up there, and you spoke about how he said, basically his myth would be exploded if he was exposed to the bright lights of London in the treaty negotiations. But actually, when De Valera went in July after the truce was agreed, Collins was really put out that he wasn't brought along, and then when he was sent, he got really put out that he was sent. So, was there any satisfying in it?
No, and I mean, I think this is indicative of the kind of person he had been for all of these months through 1920, 1921. We came across this fascinating, we couldn't call it a letter, and we don't know who he wrote it to, but it's typical of this same kind of attitude. And the fact that someone sat down and said, "I told you so," on a piece of paper and put it in an envelope and sent it to someone, I think tells you a little bit about the kind of mindset. He was someone who you can imagine must have been very, very difficult to actually work with, because you do get the feeling that he thought there was no job he couldn't do better himself.
And sometimes he was right.
And sometimes he definitely was right. But it must have added to that sense of tension amongst the cabinet. It added to a sense of tension that in a way expressed itself once this piece of paper came home from London. That, some of the division is very much on the basis of personality and how well he did or didn't get on with certain people. And the fact that, the pro-treaty side very quickly comes from that position, if it's good enough for Mick, it's good enough for me, that, he becomes very much part of why some people do accept the treaty. But yeah, he does make a fuss both times as to whether he should or shouldn't go. Looking at how he involves himself in so many different aspects of everything that's been going on from, arguably 1917 onwards, I can't imagine he would want to have sat at home either.
He would have complained if he'd been left behind again.
I think he would have complained if he was left at home.
Will, there's that sense of him as, I think Peter Hart had it, he was a brilliant boss and a great subordinate, but an absolutely awful colleague. And he was pretty awful to poor W.T. Cosgrave. He gave out about the way he ran his department. He gave out about Austin Stack with considerable reason, in fairness. But he was difficult.
He was extremely difficult, and as Anne said, he had a very clear sense that he could do the job better than anybody, and he had no qualm about trespassing across apparent boundaries in departments. Poor Desmond Fitzgerald got a terrible time from him, a terrible rap. He was constantly writing letters to Art O'Brien in London complaining about Desmond Fitzgerald's running of the publicity or propaganda department. That was very interesting. It was also driven, I think, by a sense an enormous capacity for work. He really was absolutely extraordinary in that regard. So he had his various roles in the IRA, in the General Headquarters. As Anne mentioned in her talk, he was simultaneously Minister for Finance. The Department of Foreign Affairs he thought was being run pretty poorly, and he was right, and so he started to interfere with there. One of the reasons perhaps why he might have been a good candidate to go to London was not just that he had been in London himself for a considerable period of his youth, but he was the person who had maintained the link between the Dáil and London right through 1920 and 1921, which a huge volume of daily correspondence with Art O'Brien, who was the Dáil's representative in London. And through that correspondence, I think he, perhaps better than many of the others, had a sense of the different factions inside British politics and a sense of the personalities, because O'Brien was communicating this back to him regularly.
Okay, and I think you mentioned the fact that, we sometimes tend to think of Collins the soldier in the early period who then becomes transformed into Collins the politician, but of course he was both all the time.
All the way through. And I think we have downplayed, that has been downplayed, not least because of the popularity of those photographs that were taken when he was finally in uniform. And I think it has stopped us actually looking at the totality of him throughout his entire career. There's very little evidence of the fighting man in some respects, but I think it has hampered the degree to which we have engaged with this idea of him as the Minister for Finance. This is a key role. We wouldn't now today send someone to negotiate an international treaty for us without sending probably the Minister for Finance. And we still don't think of him in that role in London. And yet he's a key part of that subcommittee on financial negotiation. And as Will said in his talk, that's one of the key things that he manages to achieve just at the last minute in the negotiations.
There's a question here from Richard Wolfe. Were there any alternatives suggested to having the conference in London, Liverpool perhaps, where there was a large Irish population? I don't think there was any suggestion, which meant that right from the start, they're off on the wrong foot. They're in the enemy's house negotiating.
I don't know, I think there was some sort of, Lloyd George came up with some sort of idea that he'd just been on holidays in Gairloch, I think, up in Scotland, and there was some sort of notion that this is a lovely spot, let's have it up here. And he was very quickly told, Prime Minister, no thank you, by his own team. They didn't want to spend whatever about the summer being okay there. They did not want to spend October, November, December up there. But I think if we forget, the British delegation are continuing to run politics on a day-to-day basis. In the sense, the Irish delegation are there to do the Irish delegation job. We sometimes forget that this is interrupting, day-to-day British political life. You can see it even at the times of day that the initial sessions sometimes happen at. They start at 5 o'clock in the evening. So there's all of these things going on, definitely, but London was key.
Yeah, and Will, so they're in the enemy's capital, so that gives an advantage to the British in terms of negotiation. But also, as was mentioned earlier, the Irish side hadn't cleared what they wanted, really, and they arrived without a draft treaty to present, so immediately you're working off the British draft, so you're on the back foot again. Completely,
and they're constantly responding to British initiatives during the treaty process as the British develop further versions of the proposals, and the Irish are always responding. And in part that's because they have to. Sinn Féin was constructed in 1917 really as a coalition made up of Griffithites who are certainly not ideological Republicans. They may be separatists. There's the IRB, there's the Irish people who come through for the Irish Volunteers. So there's various groups and they have various priorities. And I mean, everyone I think is aware that some wings of the party would be perfectly content with something short of a republic, while for others the republic is absolutely necessary. And the fact that they can't resolve that internal disagreement in advance of the negotiations is a key problem for them as the negotiations happen. And obviously once the treaty is signed, that opens up that cleavage transparently for everyone in the country again, and the coalition that was created in 1917 just comes asunder in the face of the treaty. Now, I'm very interested in that because what different people believed, and you mentioned what Collins believed. But Anne, in your book you quote a letter that Collins wrote to Thomas Ashe in 1917, and he's talking about getting involved with Arthur Griffith, which didn't go down too well with the prisoners in Lewes jail at the time. But Collins writes to Ashe, "For God's sake, don't think that Master A.G., Arthur Griffith, is going to turn us all into 82ites," by which he meant Griffith's Parliament of 1782. So the Collins of 1917 would have no truck with the idea of a separate Irish Parliament still under the British Crown. And yet the Collins of 1921, albeit reluctantly, accepts it. What changed?
You have to admit, a lot of water has gone under the bridge, and this is again, something Will said earlier. This is someone who has become, and arguably maybe always was, but has certainly become, because of what's happened in the meantime, a much more pragmatic figure. He's much more prepared to deal, as I think I mentioned in the talk, as Pakenham said, he's going to deal with the things in front of him. He's going to do something with what he can actually get, as opposed to being concerned with symbols and those things that De Valera is much more concerned by. I mean, I think he's also in a situation where he's going there arguing someone else's ideas. And that's a very, very difficult position to put a negotiation team in. The external association,
which none of them apparently understood.
Exactly, and in a way they're there without having the full plan in hand. I mean, they're writing back saying, "Could you give us give us the stuff on Ulster before Monday at 10?" And unfortunately, the British delegation bring it up on Friday. So he's in a very, very tricky position, but he's also in a position where he knows exactly what could and couldn't be done if these negotiations break down. And it's very striking to see both himself, some of the senior, sort of, as we might say, senior IRA figures are quite revealing when you get to the stage of the treaty debates. Richard Mulcahy, for example, Chief of Staff of the IRA, is saying things like, "We couldn't last more than 7 minutes in a stand-up fight against the British Army if they were let loose." And I mean, Collins is clear. He has this really interesting interview with Claire Sheridan, who's a cousin of Churchill, who comes to Ireland to sort of chat to whoever she can as a journalist for the New York World. And he says to her, what were the British do? Why didn't they let the army loose? We would have been devastated. So that gap between 1917 and 1921, although a relatively short period of time, a lot has happened. He has become much more, conscious of what it would take to keep going at that point.
I think one of the things about him that emerged for us when we were working him is just quite, this is a young man who's developing constantly and developing at a very rapid rate under pressure. And so he's quite fluid. And one of the things about ideological political commitment, I suppose, is to some extent it involves a sort of willing suspension of disbelief. And the other thing, it involves, systematic thinking at the same time. These seem opposed, but you have to do both. And Collins, I think, he was too flexible and fluid a sort of mind to take that, to sit in one fixed position, if that makes sense. So I think it's entirely understandable that between 1917 and 1921, he's prepared, he's thinking about his ground, he's prepared to shift it. But also, I think it's very important, that sense of himself, that, he wants to be able to mark achievement. He wants to be able to say, we have done something. And I think when he sits down at those negotiations in October 1921, he already, I think, most of those on the Irish side, I think, have a clear idea there's only one kind of deal on offer, really. And it's about a process of getting themselves to the point where they can, sign that deal, if that makes sense. And I have a sense of him in those final days that he has made a decision that the deal has to be done. It's best signed and to bring home a treaty rather than to bring home some other draft or version of a conversation back to Dublin that may collapse.
Okay, and may also lead to further discussions with De Valera, which had already, I think, driven all of them to distraction. There's a couple of questions that are kind of linked. I'll just try and put them all together. Maria Kane, was Collins beguiled by Lloyd George? David, is it known what Collins and Lloyd George thought of each other on a personal level? And he then goes on, would Lloyd George have gone to war, or was he bluffing with the two letters? I'll come back to that. So let's just think about the personal relationship. And then Maria asks, did Collins get along with Churchill on a personal level? So just that interaction between Collins, and he's come trailing the whiff of cordite into the heart of London. And as you pointed out, I think, Anne, there was a risk for the British leaders in dealing with him.
Massive risk. I mean, if you think about it, Austen Chamberlain is coming from a position where, his father has, shifted his whole political position because of Ireland. These are people who have a lot to lose in terms of their reputation, potentially their careers over this. This is one of the toughest Houses of Commons for, if you like, to negotiate from, if you like, for the British delegation. And I think in a way, it's really tricky to get at what they actually thought of him, because you're getting insights from, if you like, people on the edges of the negotiations, like C.P. Scott, editor of it slipped my mind now, the Guardian, the Manchester Guardian. He's having breakfast with Lloyd George, and he's getting these insights, and he's saying, well, he doesn't think much of him, he does think a lot of him now. Lloyd George was apparently impressed by him at the start and not impressed by Griffith at the beginning, and then switches as some of the meetings go on. So Lloyd George is changing his view of him. Churchill, in a way, is again tricky, because Churchill is not shy of elaborating on a good story as he writes The World Crisis, his multi-volume account of the First World War and whatnot. And Churchill doesn't lose anything, as I said, in the telling. But again, there's these reports, as I said in the talk in the newspapers, that Collins and Churchill are having a great time telling each other about their war stories and sharing war stories, and this has to be damped down at the outset of the negotiations, again reflecting the delicacy of all this. Behind the scenes, you're getting a sense that Lloyd George gets his hands on a report of Collins going to visit Irish prisoners in Britain, and that he's deeply unimpressed by the reports, that he's supposed to have turned up at one of the prisons drunk, and this does not go down well inside the negotiations. So, again, it's very, very tricky to know what they really thought of each other. There's a sense of, that reluctance to shake their hands, or being seen to shake their hands. Lloyd George kind of handles this by shaking their hands at the door, and then they just go in and they sit down. it's said that, you know, Churchill, when the negotiations ended, got up and put out his hand and was prepared to shake hands with them. Again, it's felt that Birkenhead got on well with them, you know, and it's felt Pakenham says Birkenhead got into Collins's head. And, you know, that they actually had a lot in common. So, you know, again, how much of this is anecdote, how much of these are good stories after the event, you know, we don't know.
One of the questions there asked the question about the two letters, and this is a piece of Lloyd George's theatre on the last night, the two letters. One means peace and one means war, and he has a train at Euston Station with the steam up, and it's going to go to Holyhead, and it's going to there's a destroyer waiting there to go to Belfast and hand whichever letter it is to Sir James Craig. Now, I think Lloyd George's secretary, Geoffrey Shakespeare, arrived in Belfast about 2 hours earlier than he would have done if he'd just got the mailboat. Geoffrey Shakespeare thought this was complete nonsense because he could have picked up the telephone and rung him. And Collins isn't stupid. Collins must know this. So why did Collins fall for it? Or did he fall for it? Or was it just he was playing along with theatre?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is back to something I said, in the last answer. And in a sense, I think at that point, Collins has already decided he's signing, he's signing the deal. Over the last couple of days, I mean, they returned to Dublin on the 3rd of December, and there was a big row at Cabinet. And they're sent back to London with quite confused instructions, and Collins is really irritated and annoyed at this point. And I think that annoyance probably contributed to his hardening of his mind to sign a deal. And he stays away from the first initial meeting between the return delegation and the British. Peter Hart kind of suggests he's in a sulk, but I think what's happening is a little bit more strategic than that. I think he knows that the meeting is bound to fail, and he's waiting for the next invitation back from Lloyd George to try that meeting that will bring the negotiations back from the brink. And so I think by the day before, it seems to me that Collins has decided he's going to sign a deal, but he's pushing really hard for the last few concessions on things like trade, on a slight alteration of the oath, on things like how the military. What's allowed to the Irish in terms of military capacity. And once he's achieved that few extra concessions, he was ready to sign, threat or no threat, I think.
Yeah, okay. There's a couple of questions about the IRB. I'll just read a couple of them. Colin Murphy, do you think Collins believed that as head of the IRB he was the actual president of the Republic, or did he see the IRB as simply one tool in managing the national movement? There's another one, I think, can't find it. Something about how much of a role did the IRB have, and how well did Collins keep them in the loop? Because on December the 3rd there was a meeting of the IRB Supreme Council which made its own suggestion about a potential oath, which was actually closer to what it became the actual oath.
I think Collins he was very aware, I think. He had political failings, but one of his political successes, I think, during the treaty negotiations is the extent to which he prepared the ground with the IRB for the compromises that were to come, at least the leadership of the IRB. There was a wider Republican family beyond the leadership of the IRB, which I think was quite shocked when he returned, having signed the deal. But the leadership of the IRB, he had been preparing for the compromise that would come. And I think he was aware also during the negotiations of other audiences that needed to be addressed. So, for instance, he was very conscious of the prisoners who were still being held, despite the fact that there was a truce, and that those spaces were still, places of revolution and conflict, despite the fact that the rest of the country was a truce. And he was very clear about, for instance, setting up a process whereby the camps were inspected and the prisons were inspected, but it was more than that. The liaison officers going in were not just looking at conditions, they were communicating the message, and they were saying, you've got to hang on, you've got to wait, trust us. So there was political management going on as well, constantly in that regard.
The first question actually we got in was from David Flood, who points out it was become a common accusation among the anti-treaty people that the London delegation were bedazzled by the high social life of the imperial capital. Is there justice in that? And David Flood, particularly in the case of Arthur Griffith, but obviously Collins is talked about more, and there's a couple of questions about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting. There's some great documents in the National Archives where it talks about some of the, you get some of the receipts from Harrods. You have a sense that they go over with a sense of, we have to put on a good show. We have to, show that we are, of equal status and stature as the people we're going to sit down and negotiate with. They arrive in hired cars on the first day of the negotiations. By the end, those cars have gone. So there's an element of a performance about what's going on. But in a way, yes, there's a lot of that. Even as I said, the press have cottoned on to the degree to which there is this fuss around the delegation, this urgency to see them, the urgency to have them at dinners and this kind of thing. And to say that they were bedazzled by this is maybe too harsh. I mean, these are accusations that come up in the treaty debates, that, Collins lost his head in London, that he was, taken aback by the sights and the sounds and the company and all the rest of it. Again, I think that's a fairly, unfair accusation in many respects. I think, again, we have to think back that Collins was very familiar with London. He knows London better than anybody else in that delegation. Maybe, apart from Childers, obviously, who's there as part of the delegation and the team. But this is someone, I think, and given the intensity of the exchanges of material between them, but also between them and Dublin, the amount of information that's coming back to Dublin, however much they may or may not have gone out for dinner of an evening, or who they went to dinner with, I think it's slightly unfair to say that somehow undermined the intensity of those negotiations.
I haven't seen a question coming in yet about this, but I bet there's one there somewhere. Was he drunk half the time, Will?
I don't think there's any really evidence for this at all. Although, I mean, obviously there were occasions, there were blowouts like Anne described when he went, it was to Wormwood Scrubs, I think, on that occasion. And clearly it's late in the evening and he turns up and he demands to see a particular prisoner and, spends the evening swapping stories with him. But I think the allegations of constant drunkenness are, again, just another of those sort of allegations that are thrown at him by those who are upset by the results. Maura Comerford has a memoir, a manuscript memoir, and she kind of has this moment where she thinks everything went to hell, and it's because Collins relaxed, and the way it was signalled that he relaxed is he put his feet up on the table at the negotiations, and hence Ireland was lost. Is the kind of image.
But it kind of shows that, in a way, the need to find an excuse, like, that desperation of why is everything falling apart? Why are we splitting? Why has this happened? And I think it really does and it's back to something Will said there a few minutes ago, the degree to which this is a moment where these people who have been together under this umbrella suddenly have to decide, what do you mean by those big words that you've been using? What does freedom mean? What does independence look like? And this piece of paper sort of says, these 18 clauses, this incredibly short document when you think about it, they have to make a decision now. Can you live with these being the definitions of what independence might look like, at least for a while? And, the other thing I suppose you just think about, he's also, writing home and saying he's going to Brompton Oratory quite a lot. He's also doing that type of thing. So, this is you have to kind of take both sides of his behaviour. If you're going to accuse him of being drunk in the evening, he was going for a good mass in the morning.
Okay, that makes up for it then. I'll bear that in mind. We've a question for Anne from Desk. You suggest that the British media portrayal of Collins was deliberately softened in preparation to accept him as a negotiator. Can you say when this change from bogeyman to statesman began?
I mean, there's a real urgency to get the first picture of him. I mean, there's a first picture of him in the paper in March 1921. He definitely, the image starts to soften once you get to the truce point. Once you get to that moment where there's a realisation, and Lloyd George is saying it, and again, it really drives home the point, the degree to which the fact that, as I said earlier, C.P. Scott is having breakfast with Lloyd George. This shows you how close some of those relationships between British politicians and the press were at that stage. But you can really see the softening of him in October, coming up to October, and from October to December. It hardens again at very key moments after the treaty's been signed. Around the time of the pact with De Valera, the British press go for him again. There's a real sense of he's not what we expected. This is not okay. And once you get the if you like the the attack on the forecourts, once you see the pictures of Collins in the uniform, he's back to being this kind of heroic figure again. But it's really striking. I think G.K. Chesterton gives a talk in the LSE shortly after all of this, I think it's 1923, and he really does talk about the degree to which the British press shows that capacity. I think I mentioned in another context there in the paper that the British capacity to forget certain things when it's convenient is really important, and you sort of see it particularly in the coverage of his funeral is very striking in terms of how the British press deal with his funeral, and I think it's Ormond Winter talks about it in terms of I read the press coverage of the funeral, and it made me want to vomit. That's how he puts it. Such is his level of contempt for this coverage of him and the softening of the coverage. Yeah.
We have a question from Des Dalton. Was it a serious error on the part of Griffith and Collins to meet Lloyd George separately and alone? What do you think, Will?
This is one of these questions that I'm never sure how to answer, to be honest. These sort of counterfactuals. It certainly exacerbated some of the suspicions around afterwards, after the signing. It certainly led to jealousies. It opened up a space where rumour could flood in.
The British chose their men.
And so it allowed a space where rumour could flood in, I think, which was certainly a problem for them. So it was probably a poor decision in terms of the politics after the signing. Whether it helped to get to a deal or not is another matter, and it arguably it may have. And if you liked the deal, then that's a good thing. And if you didn't like the deal, that's not a good thing.
Tom Jones talks about it a little bit in his diaries in terms of Lloyd George was slightly frustrated by the plenary sessions, the 7 plenary sessions where they all meet together. And there's a sense in which Lloyd George kind of felt that, or Jones puts it, that Lloyd George couldn't turn on his charisma, or he couldn't turn on that sort of personal interaction. Lloyd George liked being on a one-to-one basis with someone that he negotiated with, not least because he could say, he could do as he did. Griffith says, agrees to something, and then he can use it against them. And again, as it says, it sows dissension amongst the Irish delegation.
You can also tell different people different things.
Absolutely.
Which is very important when you're negotiating. Now, we have a couple of questions about the Boundary Commission, but I'm going to choose one from one of my bosses in RTE, Shane McElhatton. With Collins's legendary attention to detail, why didn't he spot the differences between the Boundary Commission clauses offered to Griffith in November and what appeared in the treaty? The legal advisers warned Griffith the treaty version was so vague it could mean anything, and this is obviously what turned out to be the case.
I mean, he's not alone in not missing this. I mean, if you think about it, De Valera's alternative, his document number 2, takes that section and puts it in verbatim. In a way, it tells us, I think, a lot about a lack of thinking about Northern Ireland, a lack of imagination about Northern Ireland. And that arguably goes back to Parnell's time. I mean, this is nothing new in a way. There's a sense in which this, their position on Northern Ireland, in a way, that was the thing they were told. If it's going to break down on Ulster, because that was the position that was where the British delegation were weakest. And in a way, once that has been ceded, they're in a very difficult position. And I think in some respects, as I said, this lack of thought and creativity, and a sense of this will kick the can down the road in a way, and we can see what can be done with it then. I mean, that instinct of Collins could sometimes be very difficult, and you can see it in terms of what his thinking on the oath as well. He gets that change on the oath, and with that thought, well, we'll write a constitution that doesn't mention the king. There's, in some ways, the way he worked he was almost a little bit too clever by half at times, maybe. But certainly, as I said, that taking of the boundary clause and putting it directly into document 2, I think again shows just that he's not alone in this. He really isn't.
Yeah, and in fairness, I mean, Republicans who bitterly opposed the treaty all assumed that the Boundary Commission would do what they expected to. And there's a couple of questions about this. Niamh, why did they appear to accept the Boundary Commission so easily as a solution to partition? Lynn, a slightly different take on that question. Did Lloyd George think the Boundary Commission could lead to the border changing, or was he tricking the Irish with it? There's an interesting one there.
I'm not sure how much it mattered to him, I suppose.
Yeah.
George, yes.
But I suppose if you think about it physically, the amount of space Northern Ireland takes up physically in the treaty, the number of clauses, I think it takes up the most. I mean, the various different references to it in different shapes and forms. It's very present in many different respects. But, you know, at the same time, and there's agreement, and there has been agreement from De Valera from earlier on, that there is, at no point is there going to be coercion of Ulster into this. So, you know, this is a point that has been conceded on all sides, and they have agreement on that from even before the negotiations start. So, and again, that's an important thing to bear in mind.
Couple of mentions of a portrayal of Michael Collins on the big screen, but not mentioning Liam Neeson. Actually, a couple of questions about Brendan Gleeson's portrayal of Collins in the treaty. Noel Common, I think it is. Was Gleeson's portrayal close to Collins's actual personality? I don't know whether you have a view on that.
God, it's a long time since I saw the treaty, as in Brendan Gleeson's treaty. Yeah, I mean, I remember thinking it was a much more interesting and thought-provoking portrayal, if my memory serves me right, maybe than the Neil Jordan one. And certainly gave far more attention to the treaty negotiations, gave far more attention in a way to that, to the difficulty of the negotiations and the degree to which this is a moment of renting this cohort of people apart. And that was done much more effectively, and much more time was given over to that, as far as I remember, in that version rather than the Jordan one. I don't know if you can remember it any better than me.
Okay, we'll move on. Kevin Finan, how did Collins living in a separate house in London impact on the unity of the Irish team, and was he influenced by those around him in the house, for example, Emmett Dalton? Because it was a bit odd, wasn't it?
It was a bit strange. And again, I think it's part of Colin's sense of wanting the space to constantly having a sense of needing the room to create this. Anne talked about this, needing to create a room to manoeuvre for himself. And also, I think right through the period, there's a sense that Collins was very much. He was part of a team, but he was a sole trader, I think, in many ways, even before he went to London. So I think that's important for him. It certainly does, again, influence responses afterwards. And I think this is one of the things we've kept coming back to again and again as we've been talking about this. It's very difficult not to read what happened in London in those weeks and months. Backwards, so to speak, if that makes sense, and to read all sorts of implications into what was happening, into the minor choices made, into the major choices made, and you know, Republicans, I suppose, did this more than anybody else. And it's very interesting to think about the psychology of the acceptance or not, I think, of the treaty. So, you know, the Republicans, I think for them, it's very important to bear in mind that the treaty amounted actually to a retreat from a republic achieved. Whereas for someone like Collins, actually, it was an advance forward. And that differing psychology is really, really important in the context of what happened. And it's really, I think, all these other issues around, you know, rumour and suspicion and drunkenness and where did he live and what his relationship with individuals were, can all be distilled down in some senses to where one stood on the treaty and then get, you know, retrospectively fed back in.
But I suppose as well they're going to be there they kind of know they're going to be there for a while, and there's an element of he'd much rather spend his time and his whatever free time he's going to have with the people he was with, as opposed to being stuck in a house with these somewhat older individuals.
That brings me to another question from anonymous attendee, whoever they are. Who did Collins see as the senior partner between him and Griffith? Because Griffith is the head of the delegation, at least formally.
I think he does look to Griffith, and you can see his respect for Griffith grows over those weeks and that time in London. I mean, he's obviously disagrees with him about certain things. He's deeply frustrated when, you know, Lloyd George brings the rabbit out of the hat at the last moment in terms of what he's got from Griffith in those private, you know, meetings. I mean, there's a frustration then in turn with Griffith for Collins when we get to the pact with De Valera. There's a sense in which it's said that he only refers to him as Mr. Collins for a while after that. So, I mean, there's a tension with him. And again, it's just that sense of he can be a difficult person to work with, and no matter who it is, they find at various times they have those sort of tense moments with him.
Yes, it's not unknown for politicians, even in the same party, to fall out sometimes or do whatever. Which brings me to another fascinating question, which is possibly impossible to answer, but Seamus McSwivna, what would Collins have made of Cosgrave becoming his successor?
I mean, there's a really interesting piece in the, I think there's an Irish Times profile of Cosgrave after he takes over, and they describe him as looking like the manager of a railway company. And in a way, he's almost the anti, there's this sense of him as being the anti-Collins choice. He even looks like he's a middle-aged, steady kind of figure. But it's really interesting, and there's a sense that there's a British report after Collins dies as well, who is going to replace him? What would be the right kind of figure? And they're very clear that it should be a strong military figure who's going to, finish the Civil War very quickly.
Presumably.
And in a way, Bill Kazan has made this point in a very interesting way, that actually it's the more civilian politicians who in a way go on to do things that maybe some of the military figures couldn't have contemplated at that point. And he makes this case that it's the more civilian types who then, bring in, the type of legislation they do, or decide to undertake executions in the way that they do. So there's metal there, and that metal maybe is given an extra impetus by the fact that Collins is gone. And very quickly these people find themselves in a position where Collins being gone is a way to say this free state has to be protected, and has to be protected in the form that it now exists in. So in some ways Cosgrave, he possibly mightn't have been too impressed, but in a way, it's an interesting choice at the same time.
I mean, it's not uncommon for political parties to choose the successor exactly because he's not the person who's gone before. And I mean, Anne talked when she was speaking about the Republican sense of Collins as having acquired too much power, having become outsized, having acquired too much influence, as being given too much credit. And I think by the time he's killed, there are those in his own cabinet with him, in the Irish Free State cabinet, who have the same feeling about him, to be honest.
Yeah.
And that's possibly one of the reasons that Cosgrave becomes the successor.
You write in the book a bit about this idea that Collins had become a dictator in the period just after the outbreak of the Civil War. The third Dáil hadn't met. He kept postponing it. He'd assumed power, as a great deal of power, the War Council of himself, Mulcahy and O'Duffy, was it? And that idea has been put forward, I think, by John Regan about Collins as dictator. Is there validity to that?
I mean, Joe Lee makes the argument that in the position that he was in, given all the different threads that he had in hand at that stage, that he was actually very tempered in his use of his power. I mean, what is striking, and I think Michael Hayes makes this point after he dies, that Collins could be replaced within a matter of hours, that if you like, the movement doesn't fall with him. And this in a way is the first time this has happened, unlike when Parnell goes. There's a sense for Hayes that in a way Collins' importance at that point, and what the real, if you like, strength of what he leaves behind is a whole sequence of organisations and systems and processes that work, and someone else can take up the reins. And that's really quite striking, that Hayes is able to say that as quickly after his death as he does. That for the first time, if you like, as he puts, the movement doesn't collapse because the leader has gone. Which does suggest that, he's maybe not quite as powerful as he himself might have thought he was, or might have liked to have been. Yeah. But you can see, as Will just said there a minute ago, they're making decisions that are turning against some of his wishes, even before he dies. Even in the last few days, there's a sense that his position in Northern Ireland isn't really what they would quite like to continue with as things go on. So there's a pull. He's been pulled back in.
It may have. How long the Civil War lasted may have affected the outcome. Do you know what I mean? So the longer the emergency lasts, the longer he has, a great deal of power to himself. The longer the Dáil is suspended, then I suppose it's more likely that you know all those systems that you talk about may have withered away in the face of his control. But you know, he's killed, and we, you know.
Leanne Lane asked a question about Mary McSweeney, which is understandable because she is, I think, writing a book about Mary McSweeney, and she says that, you know, what was Collins's reaction to her, because Mary McSweeney was writing these long, detailed letters to Dev, and Leanne suggests that she thinks Dev did take some of what she had to say on board. What about Collins? Because he would have been, at one stage, he would have been reasonably close to Mary McSweeney, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure, to be honest, is the honest answer about his relationship with McSweeney. I know, for instance, that at the point of Terence's hunger strike, there certainly would have been divisions between them, and a gap would have opened up between them. Collins was deeply sceptical about hunger strike. He was very disturbed by McSweeney's trauma and by McSweeney's death. I think Collins would have favoured, actually, if possible, calling a halt to that hunger strike, whereas Mary obviously was deeply traumatised by what happened to her brother, but she was very strong in standing behind and beside him, and at no point was going to call into question what he was doing. So at that moment there certainly, I think, is division between them, and clearly they're really they're acres apart when it comes to the moment of the treaty, but generally a sense of what personal relationship they had with each other, I'm not at all sure.
I mean, I think in a way, one of the problems, and again, it's been a part of the sort of pro-treaty propaganda that emerged very quickly, like even things like referring to the anti-treatyites as the Women and Childers Party, you know, this type of thing. But how quickly the women are portrayed, and particularly because, and maybe partly because of Mary gives one of the, I think, the longest contributions to the treaty debates, but how quickly their contributions to those debates were diminished in terms of how they were portrayed by the pro-treatyites, and their position as TDs was diminished to being relatives of a particular individual or a particular figure, as opposed to actually listening to their arguments in their own right. I mean, Ada English was not there as anybody's relative. She was there very much in her own right, and had lots of quite interesting things to say, and had things to say about Northern Ireland, which many of the TDs at the debates didn't have much to say at all about. And I think in a way, and it's great that Leanne is doing that work on Mary McSweeney, because for a long time she has been dismissed, partly because of how she was depicted in the context of the treaty debates. That said, you know, the debates got pretty nasty, and particularly after the Christmas break, and so there was a real sort of viciousness.
At a general level, I don't think there's any real sense that among his political confidants, among the people whose opinions he took seriously, that there were women. You know, there were women who he worked closely with, okay, but that was different to women with whom he consulted and took advice from, I would say. So in that regard, you know, I think one of the great, I suppose, questions of the age was, you know, women's role in public life, and you're coming straight out of the women being granted the vote and the suffrage movement. But I have no great sense that Collins was at the forefront of that kind of development.
And Dev actually said that he didn't put Mary McSweeney on the delegation because Collins and Griffith wouldn't work with them. So Dev, the great champion of women's rights, as he's so rightly regarded, felt that Collins and presumably Griffith were misogynists. Interesting. There's a question here from Barry, no surname. Any comment on the fact that Collins was 30 years of age at the start of the negotiations, the youngest of all the delegates, yet he was expected to achieve the unachievable compromise of the most important element to any treaty between countries? It is extraordinary when you think about his age.
It's back to that, I think, point Will made earlier, and again, thinking from that move, as you said, from 1917 to 1921. It's hard to remember sometimes just how young he is, in a way how little experience he has, but also the degree to which he has, you know, and it's back to that work ethic that was mentioned earlier, his capacity and his appetite for work in so many different sides of, if you like, what has happened from 1917 onwards is quite phenomenal when you see just the amount of paper he created. There's a lovely moment where I think Ernie O'Malley describes meeting him, I think in 1921, and he said throughout the entire conversation he continued to write. He never looked up from the page, he just kept going. And just that sense of activity, which is... And rudeness. Rudeness is in a way, is really quite striking. And I think you do have to check yourself. And I think that's something I was kind of conscious of, certainly looking at the sources, but also in putting the book together. Just how young he is and how much he has grown from that youngster in London who's writing. There's this lovely, notebook that I think is now in UCD archives of him writing down new words he has learned, trying to improve himself as a teenager, and the degree to which this is the person who is sitting, as Barry has said, by the age of 30 or so, at a table in Downing Street.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap up soon. I mean, given the evil eye here, but Julita Clancy, I'm sorry for mangling your first name, says she came across an item in the children's papers in TCD where Art O'Brien, who Sinn Féin's representative in London, writing to Childers on December 6th, seems quite miffed with the delegation. He had just received 2 copies of the Articles of Agreement, but wanted to put on record that this was the first official communication he'd had from the delegation. So was Art O'Brien was kind of sidelined at this period?
Yeah. He was there early on when they arrived, and he's part of it then. But O'Brien himself really wanted to be part of the delegation. He felt that this would be entirely appropriate, given that he'd effectively been the Irish representative in London for the previous couple of years. O'Brien, became firmly anti-treaty in the aftermath, and he himself and Collins fell out really, really, really badly, and the relationship between them became quite sour. For instance, O'Brien is constantly pushing at Collins' failure, back to prisoners again, failure to achieve the release of prisoners in the aftermath of the signing of the treaty, and Collins feels harried and upset and betrayed by O'Brien's haranguing of him. So that relationship breaks down pretty bad.
Okay, we better leave it there. I'll just read one last comment from Niall. Excellent presentations. Will transcripts be available at some point? I'm not sure about that, but you can buy the book. Niall. It's called Michael Collins, The Man and the Revolution, published in 2018. It is written by Anne Dolan and Will Murphy, who we would like to thank very sincerely for their excellent presentations. We should also thank Sandra Collins and the National Library of Ireland for the lend of the hall, Orla McBride and everyone at the National Archives for organising, particularly Elizabeth McAvoy. Organising these events is a bit like herding cats, but Elizabeth is from Kilkenny, so therefore she has an advantage. Peter Grogan and his team at Imagine for making it all happen so smoothly. Well, it was smooth here. I hope it was smooth at your end. To our 2 interpreters, Orla McCabe and Shelley Parkinson, who have done a marvellous job. Give yourself a round of applause there. And it is Irish Sign Language Week, so it's particularly appropriate to have them with us, so thank you. Before we go, a quick reminder, I think Orla mentioned it earlier, the exhibition presented by the National Archives in partnership with the National Library and the Royal Irish Academy, The Treaty 1921 Records from the Archives, which opens in the Coach House Gallery in Dublin Castle on December the 6th and runs until March 27th. Entry is free, is it? Entry is free. So get yourselves along there, and I'm sure you will enjoy that. And that's it. Thanks everybody for tuning in from all those parts of the globe. Hello to Brazil. Lovely to have you. Thanks for your attention. Thanks for your questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them, but we got through as many as we can. And sure, we'll see you the next time.